The call came at 2:13 in the morning. 3 hours later, Elena Carter would be sitting inside a police station while a detective told her something impossible. Her husband was dead. Police said he had attacked them during a confrontation, but days later, Elena would discover something on Daniel's phone that suggested a far more dangerous truth. A recording, one that powerful people never expected anyone to hear. And once she pressed play, an entire system began to unravel. For years afterward, Elena Carter would replay those 3 seconds in her mind. The vibration of her phone against the wooden nightstand, the way the sounds sliced through the quiet of the house, the strange feeling in her chest before she even picked it up. Some people say tragedy arrives suddenly, but sometimes it arrives with a warning you can't quite explain. Elena had been asleep beside her husband, Daniel, just minutes earlier. The house was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. Their small home sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever happened. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other while mowing their lawns, where kids rode bikes in the street until sunset, where the biggest scandal anyone remembered was a neighbor arguing over a property line. Daniel shifted beside her in bed as the phone buzzed again. "Who calls at this hour?" he muttered, his voice thick with sleep. Elena reached for the phone and squinted at the screen. Unknown number. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she answered. "Hello?" A man's voice came through the line. Cold, professional. "Is this Elena Carter?" "Yes." "Ma'am, this is Officer Grant from the County Police Department. We need you to come down to the station immediately." Her heart skipped. "What's going on?" There was a pause on the other end. Then the man said words she would never forget. "It's about your husband." 3 hours earlier, Daniel Carter had kissed his wife goodbye on the front porch. It had been an ordinary evening, the kind of ordinary that feels invisible until the moment it disappears. Daniel was 38 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with a calm presence that made people trust him almost immediately. He worked as a civil engineer for a regional infrastructure company, the kind of job that involved long hours reviewing blueprints, inspecting bridges, and meeting with city planners about construction projects. It wasn't glamorous work, but Daniel believed in it. He liked building things that lasted. Elena often joked that he treated every project like he was leaving behind a piece of himself for the future. "Someone's gonna drive across that bridge 50 years from now," he would say, "and they'll never know who built it." Elena would smile and reply, "But you'll know." Their life together had grown slowly, like a tree putting down deep roots. They met 12 years ago at a community volunteer event, painting classrooms in an aging elementary school. Elena had been working as a nurse at the time, exhausted from long hospital shifts, but she still showed up on her day off because she believed helping people mattered. Daniel had been on a ladder, repainting a ceiling. He accidentally spilled half a tray of paint onto the floor and onto Elena's shoes. Instead of apologizing immediately, he froze, staring down in horror at the mess. Elena looked at the dripping paint, then at him, and started laughing. That moment became the beginning of everything. They married 3 years later, bought their house soon after. It wasn't large, but it was theirs. A small backyard with a crooked oak tree. A kitchen where Elena insisted on cooking too much food whenever friends came over. And a living room where Daniel spent weekends sketching designs on yellow legal pads. To most people who knew them, their lives seemed steady, predictable, happy. But in the weeks leading up to that rainy night, something had changed. At first, Elena couldn't quite put her finger on it. Daniel had always been thoughtful, quiet sometimes, but recently he seemed distracted, restless. He would stare at his phone longer than usual, take work calls outside. Twice, she had walked into the room and watched him quickly close his laptop. "Everything okay?" she asked one evening. Daniel hesitated. Then he smiled. "Yeah, just work stuff." "What kind of work stuff?" He rubbed the back of his neck. "You know, contracts, inspections, boring things." But it didn't feel boring. It felt heavy, like something he wasn't ready to explain. Still, Elena trusted him. Daniel wasn't the type of man who kept secrets without reason. So she let it go. Until the night, everything changed. At 10:47 p.m., Daniel received a phone call. Elena was sitting on the couch watching television when she heard his voice in the hallway. "Yes," he said quietly. A pause. Then, "I understand." Another pause. His tone dropped even lower. "No, that's not something I'm willing to ignore." Elena muted the television. Daniel walked back into the living room a moment later. He looked different, tense. "What happened?" she asked. He hesitated. "Work issue." "At almost 11 at night." "Yeah." "Do you need to go somewhere?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Just for a little while." Elena frowned. "In this weather?" Rain was pouring outside now. The wind rattled the windows. Daniel grabbed his jacket. "I'll be back soon." She studied him carefully. "You're sure everything's okay?" He stepped closer and kissed her forehead. "It will be." Those were the last words he ever said to her. When Elena arrived at the police station 3 hours later, the rain had slowed to a mist. The building looked cold and sterile under the streetlights. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A tired-looking officer led her down a hallway into a small interview room. There were 2 men waiting inside. One introduced himself as Detective Alan Mercer. The other simply nodded. "Mrs. Carter," Mercer said, folding his hands on the table. "Thank you for coming in." Elena's chest tightened. "Where's Daniel?" The detective's expression remained carefully neutral. "I'm afraid there's been an incident." Her fingers gripped the edge of the chair. "What kind of incident?" The second officer spoke this time. "Your husband was involved in a confrontation tonight." Elena blinked. "A confrontation with who?" The men exchanged a brief glance. Then Detective Mercer said quietly, "With law enforcement." For a moment, Elena thought she misunderstood. "What do you mean?" Mercer slid a document across the table. "Your husband was stopped during a routine investigation." "That doesn't make sense." "The situation escalated." "How?" There was another pause. The detective inhaled slowly. "Mrs. Carter, your husband is dead." The words didn't land all at once. They arrived like pieces of broken glass. Dead. Daniel. Dead. Elena stared at the detective, waiting for him to correct himself, waiting for someone to say there had been a mistake. But no one spoke. "No," she whispered. The room spun slightly. "No, that's not possible." Mercer continued in the same calm tone. "There was an altercation. Officers report that your husband became aggressive." "That's a lie!" The words came out before she could stop them. Both officers looked surprised. Elena shook her head, tears forming. "Daniel isn't aggressive. He doesn't fight people." Mercer's expression hardened slightly. "The investigation is ongoing." "What investigation?" "The department will conduct a review." Elena leaned forward. What happened to him? The detective's answer was short. He was shot. The air left her lungs. Shot? By police? Her husband, the man who designed bridges and fixed broken cabinets for neighbors and spent weekends helping kids with math homework, had somehow died in a confrontation with law enforcement? It didn't make sense. None of it did. And yet, something about the way the officers avoided her eyes made a cold realization begin to form in her mind. They weren't telling her everything. 2 days later, Elena received Daniel's belongings: his watch, his wallet, his phone, and a small plastic evidence bag containing the clothes he had been wearing that night. She sat at the kitchen table staring at them for a long time. Then, she noticed something strange. The police report said Daniel had become aggressive during the stop, that he had resisted arrest, that officers had been forced to respond. But Daniel's phone told a different story, because the last thing recorded on it wasn't a message or a call. It was a voice recording. And when Elena pressed play, she heard Daniel's voice, calm, controlled. I told you already, I'm not staying quiet about this. Then a second voice cut in, sharp and threatening. You should have thought about that before you started asking questions. Then a third voice, take his phone. The struggle, the crash, and then a shotgun. The recording ended. Elena stared at the phone in stunned silence, because the official report said Daniel attacked officers first, but the recording suggested something very different, something far more dangerous, which meant one terrifying possibility was suddenly impossible to ignore. Daniel hadn't been killed during a confrontation. He had been silenced. And if that was true, then the people responsible weren't just hiding the truth. They were the system itself. The recording ended with the sound of a single shotgun. For a long moment, Elena Carter didn't move. The kitchen clock ticked quietly on the wall. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sliding across the curtains before fading into the night. But Elena sat frozen at the table, Daniel's phone still in her hand. Her fingers trembled. She pressed play again. Daniel's voice filled the quiet kitchen, calm, controlled. I told you already, I'm not staying quiet about this. Then the second voice came again, sharp and irritated. You should have thought about that before you started asking questions. Then the third voice, take his phone. The struggle, the crash, and then a shotgun. The recording ended. Elena stared at the phone in stunned silence, because the official report said Daniel attacked officers first, but the recording suggested something very different, something far more dangerous, which meant one terrifying possibility was suddenly impossible to ignore. Daniel hadn't been killed during a confrontation. He had been silenced. And if that was true, then the people responsible weren't just hiding the truth. They were the system itself. But in the recording, Daniel never sounded aggressive. He sounded determined, and someone else had clearly been worried about what he knew. A cold realization settled over her. Daniel hadn't just been killed, he had been stopped, silenced, and whoever had done it had already written the story they wanted the world to believe. The question now was terrifying in its simplicity. What had Daniel discovered? The next morning, Elena began searching through Daniel's office. His workspace was tucked into a small corner of the house, a wooden desk covered in blueprints, notebooks, and stacks of engineering reports. For years, it had been a place filled with ordinary work, bridge designs, inspection reports, city planning documents. But now, Elena looked at everything differently. She opened drawers Daniel had never locked before, flipped through folders, checked the laptop he had closed so quickly the week before. At first, everything seemed normal. Project files, emails about construction timelines, meeting schedules. Then she found the folder labeled Riverside Expansion. The file contained dozens of documents tied to a large infrastructure project the city had approved months earlier, a new highway bridge scheduled to be built across the Northern River. It was supposed to be one of the biggest construction projects in the region. Millions of dollars in funding, dozens of contractors, and several government agencies involved. Daniel had been assigned as one of the lead structural reviewers. But as Elena scrolled through the files, she noticed something strange. Several of Daniel's notes were highlighted in red. Safety concerns, structural integrity issues, warnings about material quality. One message he had written to a supervisor stood out. The materials currently approved for the Riverside expansion do not meet federal safety standards. If construction proceeds with these specifications, the bridge will be structurally compromised within 5 to 10 years. Elena leaned closer to the screen. Daniel had sent the message 2 weeks before he died. There was no reply. But buried deeper in the emails, she found something else. A draft message Daniel had started writing but never sent. The subject line read, "Urgent, evidence of procurement fraud." Elena's heart began to pound as she opened it. The email was unfinished, but Daniel's words were clear. "I believe several individuals connected to the Riverside expansion project have knowingly approved substandard materials in exchange for financial kickbacks. If this information becomes public, it could expose significant corruption within both the construction firms and local oversight offices." The message stopped there, but attached to the draft were scanned documents, invoices, contract approvals, internal memos, and one name that appeared again and again: Deputy Infrastructure Director Marcus Halstead. Elena sat back slowly. Marcus Halstead was one of the most powerful officials in the county's development department. He controlled the approval process for major construction projects, including the Riverside expansion. And if Daniel's suspicions were correct, Halstead wasn't just approving projects, he was profiting from them. Elena's mind raced. Daniel had discovered corruption in a multi-million-dollar public project, and 3 days later, he was dead. At first, Elena didn't know what to do with the information. The police had already ruled Daniel's death a justified use of force. The department had announced that officers feared for their safety during the confrontation. Case closed. But Elena had the recording, and now she had Daniel's evidence. Still, she knew going directly to the authorities might be dangerous. If people inside the system were involved, they might bury the truth before anyone else could see it. So she did something Daniel would have approved of. She found a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. She contacted Aaron Whitaker, a civil rights attorney known for taking on controversial cases against government agencies. Whitaker agreed to meet her in his office 2 days later. He was in his early 50s, with tired eyes and the calm patience of someone who had spent decades listening to stories most people preferred to ignore. Elena handed Daniel's phone first. "Just listen," she said. Whitaker played the recording. He didn't interrupt, but when the gunshot echoed through the speakers, his expression hardened. "That doesn't sound like a man attacking police," he said quietly. Elena shook her head. He wasn't. Whitaker leaned back in his chair. "You realize what you're suggesting?" "Yes. You're accusing officers of falsifying a deadly force report." "I'm accusing them of killing my husband." Whitaker studied her carefully. "You also said Daniel was investigating corruption." Elena slid the Riverside files across the desk. Whitaker read in silence for several minutes. When he finally looked up, the seriousness in his eyes had deepened. "If this information is accurate," he said slowly, "your husband may have uncovered a major fraud scheme. And they killed him to stop him." Whitaker didn't answer immediately, but he didn't dismiss the possibility either. Instead, he asked a simple question. "Are you prepared for what happens next?" Elena didn't hesitate. Yes. Because the moment she heard that recording, her life had already changed. The pushback started sooner than either of them expected. 2 days after meeting Whitaker, Elena received a visit. 2 men stood on her front porch just after sunset. They wore suits, no badges, but they introduced themselves as investigators from the State Oversight Office. "We understand you've been making inquiries about your husband's case," one of them said. Elena crossed her arms. "Yes." The man gave a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We strongly recommend allowing the official investigation to proceed without interference." Elena felt anger rising in her chest. "My husband was killed!" "And the department has already determined the officers acted appropriately." "You determined that." The second man stepped forward slightly. "Mrs. Carter, continuing to make accusations without evidence could damage reputations." Elena stared at him. "Good." The man exchanged a brief look, then the first investigator spoke again. "For your own sake, it may be best to move forward with your life." Elena didn't answer. She simply closed the door. But as their car disappeared down the street, she knew one thing for certain. They were afraid, which meant she was getting closer. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later. Whitaker had filed a formal request for body camera footage from the officers involved in Daniel's shooting. At first, the department claimed the cameras had malfunctioned, but Whitaker pushed harder, filed court motions, forced the department to produce internal records, and eventually, something surfaced. Not body camera footage, but dash camera video from a patrol vehicle parked nearby. The video had no sound, but Elena didn't need it. She could see Daniel step out of the car, his hands raised slightly in confusion. Then another vehicle pulled up behind the patrol car, a black SUV. 2 men stepped out. They weren't wearing police uniforms, but one of them was unmistakable. Marcus Halstead, the Deputy Infrastructure Director, the man connected to the Riverside Project. Elena leaned forward, her breath catching. The footage showed Halstead speaking to Daniel, Daniel gesturing angrily. Then the struggle began. One officer grabbed Daniel's arm, another reached toward his belt, and seconds later, the gun fired. Daniel collapsed. The officers moved quickly. One of them bent down and picked up Daniel's phone, exactly like the voice in the recording had ordered. "Take his phone." Elena covered her mouth, because now the truth was impossible to ignore. Daniel hadn't been stopped randomly. He had been intercepted. The lawsuit that followed shook the entire county. Whitaker filed a wrongful death case against the police department and multiple city officials. News outlets began asking questions. Journalists started digging into the Riverside expansion project. And within weeks, investigators uncovered exactly what Daniel had suspected. Millions of dollars in construction contracts had been secretly funneled through shell companies connected to Marcus Halstead. Substandard materials had been approved in exchange for kickbacks, and Daniel Carter had been preparing to expose it all. But Halstead had learned about the investigation, and instead of letting the truth come out, he arranged a meeting on a dark roadside, a meeting that was never meant to end peacefully. When the evidence became public, arrests followed quickly. Halstead, 2 police officers, and a contractor involved in the fraud scheme, all charged with multiple crimes, including conspiracy and obstruction of justice. For Elena, the courtroom hearings felt surreal. Months earlier, she had been sitting in the same kitchen where Daniel's phone first revealed the truth. Now she was watching the system that killed him begin to unravel. The verdicts took time. Trials always do. But eventually, the juries reached their decisions. Guilty, across the board. And though nothing could bring Daniel back, the truth was no longer buried. A year later, Elena stood beside the river where the Riverside Bridge was supposed to be built. The project had been canceled. New oversight regulations had been introduced, and Daniel Carter's investigation was now part of the official record that exposed the corruption. The wind moved gently across the water. Elena closed her eyes for a moment. Daniel had once said something she would never forget. People think systems are too big to fight, but systems are just people, and people could be held accountable. It had taken courage, evidence, and the refusal to accept a convenient lie. But one woman had forced the truth into the light, because when they took her husband, they thought they were silencing a problem. Instead, they created the person who would bring the entire system down. If you believe Daniel knew his life might be in danger before that night, do you think he should have handled the situation differently? If you believe one person can challenge an entire system, do you think Elena's fight will inspire others to speak up against corruption? If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, drop your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice keeps these conversations alive. And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves true crime, and subscribe to the channel for more chilling true crime stories that uncover the dark truths hidden behind closed doors.